The forest had been quiet for a long time, but Rowan still felt alone. He was a lumberjack, tall and broad, with hands made rough by cold iron and old wood. His cabin stood far from towns, far from voices. Trees did not judge him. Trees did not ask questions. That was why he stayed. But winter was coming early that year. The nights were colder, the work heavier. One man could do it, yes, but one man could also break. So Rowan walked for 2 days to reach the border market. The market rose from the mud like a wound. Torches burned low. The air smelled of rain, rust, and fear. Merchants shouted prices. Buyers laughed too loudly. Cages lined the road like broken teeth. Rowan kept his head down. He came for tools, maybe a mule, nothing more. Then he heard crying. It was soft, almost lost under the noise, almost ignored like everything else in that place. Rowan stopped. The sound came from a small shape sitting on the ground, a figure tied at the wrists, a sack pulled tightly over its head. The seller kicked the dirt beside it and laughed. "Don't be shy," the man said to passing buyers. "Goblin stock, strong back, quiet mouth." Rowan's chest tightened. He had heard stories, everyone had. Goblins were ugly, dangerous, not people. That was what the world said, so the world could sleep at night. Still, Rowan did not like the way the sack moved when the figure breathed, did not like how thin the wrists were, did not like the silence. "How much?" Rowan asked before he knew he was speaking. The seller grinned. "Cheap, no trouble, perfect for hard work." Silver changed hands. The rope was placed in Rowan's grip. Just like that, the market forgot the sack-covered figure ever existed. Rain began to fall as Rowan left. The figure followed behind him, steps uneven, body tired. Rowan did not pull the rope. He did not have to. The world had already done enough pulling. They walked into the forest together. Rowan told himself he had done nothing wrong. People bought labor all the time. He needed help. That was all. Still, the rope felt heavy. Once the figure stumbled on a root and fell. Rowan stopped. The rain soaked into his hair down his neck. "Slow," he said quietly. The sack nodded. They continued. By nightfall, the trees closed around them. The sounds of the market faded, replaced by wind and distant owls. Rowan's cabin appeared through the dark, smoke curling weakly from the chimney. "Home." Rowan cut the rope as soon as they reached the porch. "You'll eat," he said, his voice low and unsure. "Then sleep." The sack-covered figure stayed still. Rowan took a breath and reached for the knot at the neck of the sack. His fingers paused. Something in him hesitated, a warning he did not understand. He had expected sharp teeth, green skin, a monster from stories. Still, he untied the cord. The sack slid off. Rowan forgot how to breathe. The face looking up at him was not a monster's. It was young, pale, thin, one ear torn, badly healed, dark eyes wide with fear, but also something else. Hope, maybe, or disbelief. She looked at him like someone waiting for pain. Rowan stepped back as if struck. His voice broke. He had not spoken that way in years. "I'm not going to hurt you." The words sounded weak, but they were true. The girl shook, her lips moved. "Leary," she whispered. "My name is Leary." Rowan nodded slowly, like a man learning a new rule of the world. That night Rowan slept on the floor, his axe within reach but untouched. Leary sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, watching him. Outside, the forest listened. And somewhere deep inside Rowan, something old and broken began to ache again. The forest road stretched for miles, winding between dark trunks and fallen leaves. Rain still fell, soft and steady, turning the dirt into thick, sticky mud. Rowan walked slowly, boots heavy, dragging water from every step. Behind him, Leary followed, her small form slipping carefully between puddles, her hands brushing against the trees for balance. The rope was gone, but the weight of fear still clung to her like the wet cloak on her shoulders. Rowan did not speak. He had never been good with words. The forest had been his only companion, the only witness to his work and his silence. But tonight, the silence felt different, pressing, heavy. There was something in the air, a tension that made him glance back more than once. Leary stumbled on a root, letting out a tiny gasp. Rowan stopped immediately. His hand went out instinctively. "Easy," he said, his voice rough and low, yet soft enough to not scare her. She nodded, barely moving, still trembling under the weight of something more than rain. Fear, habit, memories she did not share. Rowan wondered how long it had been since she had walked freely, without chains or threats. They walked in silence for a while. Rowan thought of his cabin, the fire waiting, the walls that were his alone. He had imagined the work he would have her do: carry wood, help with chores, make the long winter easier. But now, looking at her, the plans felt wrong. She was not like the stories, not like the tales merchants told to scare children. She was small, fragile, human. The thought made his chest tighten. Rowan had spent years alone. He had thought solitude was simple. But seeing Leary there, he realized solitude was heavy. It pressed on your shoulders, it made your heart slow and your hands shake. And now he felt something unfamiliar: responsibility. A strange, heavy warmth that grew in the pit of his chest. Hours passed. The forest thickened. The trees grew closer, their branches scratching at the rain-soaked travelers like thin, accusing fingers. Leary stayed behind him, careful, silent. Rowan glanced back once and noticed her eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. They were bright, aware, alive, watching him, reading him. And yet she did not speak. She did not ask. She only followed. Finally, after what felt like eternity, the cabin appeared through the curtain of rain and mist. Smoke curled weakly from the chimney, a sign of warmth, a sign of home. Rowan stopped at the threshold, panting, soaked, exhausted. The door was small and simple, the porch slick with rain, but it was theirs. His, and now hers too, in a way he had not expected. He cut the final bindings he had brought, the rope lying useless at his feet. "You'll eat," he said, his voice uneven, unsure. "Then sleep." The words sounded strange even to him, like they had never been spoken in this world before. Leary remained still, silent, waiting, her body tense, like a small animal unsure if the danger had passed. Rowan reached for the sack that covered her head. His fingers trembled slightly, hesitant. It was not a monster he expected to find underneath. It was something far more dangerous, a human, frightened, fragile, and entirely unprotected. He untied the knot slowly, almost reverently. The sack fell away. Leary blinked, staring up at him with wide, fearful eyes. Her hair was dark and tangled, her skin pale from years without proper care. One ear was torn, scars crossing her small face. But there was more than fear there, a flicker of recognition, a tiny, fragile hope that whispered she might be safe. Rowan froze. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The rain softened, the wind paused, and the world shrank to the space between him and her. I'm not going to hurt you," he said. The words were rough, halting, but sincere. Leary's lips parted slightly, forming words he could barely hear. "Leary," she whispered. Her voice was soft, cracked, but alive. Rowan nodded slowly, unsure of what to do next. His cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt different, crowded, alive, dangerous, terrifying, but it also felt necessary. That night, Rowan did not sleep in his bed. He laid on the floor, axe within reach, listening to the fire crackle and the soft breathing of someone new in his home. Leary sat wrapped in a blanket, watching him with cautious eyes. The forest around them seemed to lean closer, protective, listening. For the first time in many years, Rowan felt that the world was not entirely empty. And deep in his chest, where solitude had once been, something fragile began to stir, something like hope. Night in the forest was darker than Rowan remembered. The fire in the cabin threw weak light across the damp wooden walls, making long shadows that danced like strange creatures. Rain tapped against the roof, a steady rhythm that matched the thump of his heart. Outside, the forest whispered in its usual language of rustling leaves and hidden eyes. Inside, Rowan could feel Leary's presence even without seeing her clearly. She sat on the floor, wrapped in the threadbare blanket he had given her. Her knees hugged close to her chest, tiny hands gripping the edges. She didn't move much, only watched him, as if expecting him to change, as if any moment he might become like the merchants and the cages and the chains she had known before. Rowan understood that fear. He had seen it in animals, in children, even in himself, and he knew it was not easy to break. "I have food," Rowan said softly, placing a small bowl of stew in front of her. He kept his back turned when she looked at it, unsure if she would trust him. After a long pause, she picked up the bowl, hands shaking slightly, and ate in small, careful bites. Rowan sat near the fire, not speaking. His axe leaned against the wall, the symbol of his strength, but tonight it was useless. Strength meant nothing here. Care meant everything. Leary glanced at him, her dark eyes reflecting the fire. For a moment her expression softened, but then it hardened again, the way fear can mask hope. Rowan could feel her story pressing against her skin, the weight of it making her small, fragile, and yet somehow fierce. He wanted to ask questions, to learn her name, her past, but he hesitated. Some things were not spoken at once. They had to be earned. Outside, the wind picked up. A branch scraped against the roof with a sharp crack, and Leary jumped, curling tighter around herself. Rowan moved instinctively, reaching out to touch her shoulder. She flinched, and he pulled back immediately. He had expected resistance, but seeing it, he realized just how deep her mistrust ran. It wasn't just fear of strangers, it was fear of being human, of being seen and heard again. "You're safe," Rowan said, quieter this time, almost to himself. The words felt strange, heavy with meaning. He had never said them to anyone, not his parents, not the merchants, not the forest itself. And yet he wanted her to hear them, wanted her to believe them, wanted her to know that, for this night at least, she did not have to hide under a sack. Slowly, Leary lowered her knees, setting the bowl aside. She looked at him, really looked at him, and in that gaze was the fragile, trembling spark of trust. Rowan held it carefully in his chest, as though it were the most delicate thing in the world. The forest outside roared and howled, but inside the cabin held a fragile peace, a small bubble against the world. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Rowan could hear her breathing, slow now, steady. She did not speak. She did not move much. But sometimes her eyes would follow him as he shifted his position or adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Those small movements, subtle and unspoken, told him more than words could, that she was beginning to see him not as a captor, but as a human being. Rowan's own thoughts were tangled. He had lived alone for years, thinking that solitude made life simple. But he realized now that solitude was heavy and hollow. It made nights longer, fires colder, and the heart slower. And yet, in sharing this night, in sharing the silence and the warmth, he felt a strange lift in his chest, a fragile opening where there had only been closed wood and iron before. Finally, exhaustion claimed them both. Rowan lay on the floor, back to the fire, arms crossed over his chest. Leary leaned slightly against the wall, blanket drawn tight, but no longer hiding her face completely. Her eyes were heavy, and for the first time since he had seen her, Rowan saw a shadow of relief, the hint of sleep overcoming fear. Outside, the forest whispered and the rain fell. Inside, a man and a girl shared a night that would change them both. A night where chains and sacks no longer mattered. A night where trust began its slow, careful work. And deep in Rowan's chest, something fragile, almost frightening in its tenderness, began to grow. The knowledge that to care for another human, even one so small and broken, could be stronger than any axe, any winter, or any fear. That night, Rowan slept differently. And when he opened his eyes at first light, he knew the forest was no longer just his companion, it was theirs. And the road ahead, though uncertain, held a promise he had not felt in years. That even in darkness, humans could find hope in each other. Morning arrived slowly, washing the forest in pale light. Rain had stopped, leaving the air wet and heavy, filled with the scent of moss and earth. Rowan stood outside the cabin, leaning on his axe, listening to birds call in cautious tones. Inside, Leary stirred, sitting on the floor with her blanket around her shoulders. She did not move quickly, she did not speak. She only watched him with those dark, wary eyes. Rowan could feel her story pressing against him again. He had seen glimpses in the night, shadows in her eyes, the flinch when he moved too fast. But now, in the quiet morning, he wanted to understand. Not as a task, not as duty, but because he could not leave her fear unspoken. "Leary," he said softly, stepping closer, "you don't have to hide from me." Her gaze met his, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then she shook her head slightly. I was not always like this," she whispered. Her voice was weak but steady enough to carry in the empty cabin. "I was taken long ago. They said I was Goblin, sold me, chained me, told me I belonged to no one." Rowan's hands trembled slightly. His chest tightened. Silver he had paid. The word bought came back to him like a bitter wind. He had thought he was doing something practical, simple. Now he understood the weight of his mistake. I didn't know," he said almost to himself. The words sounded small and inadequate, but Leary nodded, and in that gesture there was no shame, only truth. She told him more, how the sack had been pulled over her head to hide her face, make her less human, make her easier to sell. How the chains had left marks on her wrists and scars on her heart. Rowan listened in silence, gripping his axe so tightly it cut his palms. Every word tore at something inside him, a wall he had built long ago to survive alone, now crumbling. When she finished, Rowan took a step closer. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the collar around her neck. He had brought it with him, thinking it was a tool, something to keep her obedient. But now it felt like a lie, like a weight that did not belong. With one motion, he cut it and threw it into the fire. The flames hissed as metal and leather met heat, but Rowan did not flinch. "You're free," he said, voice low, steady. "Not because I paid silver, not because you worked for me. Free because you should be, free because no one can own you." Leary's eyes filled with tears. She fell to her knees, not in fear, not in submission, but in release. The tears ran down her face, carrying years of hurt, chains, and loneliness into the warmth of the cabin floor. Rowan knelt beside her, unsure of what to do, only wanting to be present as she reclaimed herself. For the first time, they were equals in the room. No ropes, no sacks, no promises bought with coin. Only two humans, one strong and steady, the other small but unbroken in spirit. The forest outside seemed to lean closer, listening, approving. The trees whispered in the wind. The birds called carefully, like witnesses to a quiet miracle. Rowan felt something shift inside him. The world had always been cold, sharp, lonely, but now, with Leary, it could be soft, gentle, and alive. She looked at him then fully, for the first time without fear hiding her face. "Thank you," she said, voice trembling but honest. Rowan shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "You did this yourself, I only let you." For hours they sat in the quiet cabin. Leary explored the small space, touching the walls, inspecting the firewood, noticing small details that Rowan had taken for granted. Rowan watched her, feeling both protective and amazed. She moved like someone learning the world again, reclaiming it piece by piece. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, scattering wet leaves and light across the forest floor. Rowan stepped outside, watching her follow slowly behind him. He realized something he had not before. Strength was not in the muscles or the axe, not in solitude or fear. Strength was in giving freedom, in letting someone breathe and choose. Strength was in seeing another human and refusing to make them a thing to be owned. And for the first time, Rowan understood that he had begun to do something bigger than cutting trees, bigger than surviving the winter. He had begun to do what humans could do best: care. Truly, fiercely, and without reservation. The forest seemed to sigh in approval, and in the quiet, Rowan knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Not for him, not for Leary, not for the empty, quiet world they were beginning to fill together. The peace of the morning lasted only until the sun reached its peak. Rowan was stacking firewood outside when he heard the first shout. It was sharp, cutting through the soft bird calls of the forest like a blade. He froze, his heart hammering. Leary was inside, arranging the small cabin with careful hands, and for the first time he felt fear, not for himself, but for her. Figures appeared through the trees, men, armed men. Their faces were cruel and hard, eyes filled with the certainty of ownership. The one in front carried a familiar grin, the kind that had sold Leary like property. Rowan's fists tightened. He had never met these men before in person, but he knew their type: hunters of human fear, traders of chains and lies. "Property," the man shouted. "Hand her over." Leary stepped behind Rowan instinctively, tiny but firm. She did not hide. The ropes were gone. The sack was gone, but her stance, though small, was proud. Rowan could feel her courage burn like fire. "She is not for sale," Rowan said, his voice steady, stronger than it had been in years. The words were not a question. They were a wall he built in front of her, a warning. The men laughed, the sound bitter and cruel. "Do you think a simple woodsman can stop us? Do you know who owns her?" Rowan took a deep breath. He did not answer. He did not flinch. His axe, heavy in his hands, was a promise and a threat all at once. But more than the axe, there was something in his eyes that the men had not expected: certainty. The kind that comes from protecting what is yours without hesitation. They lunged, metal clanged. Rowan swung his axe with precision, each strike a force of desperation and protection. Pain came, cuts, bruises, a deep ache in his ribs, but he rose every time, fighting not for glory, not for coin, but for her. Leary screamed once, then stopped. She did not run, she stayed, watching, waiting, learning. The men underestimated her. They did not see the fire in her small body. With one movement, Leary grabbed a fallen branch, swinging with a strength born of fear, anger, and survival. Her eyes were fierce, dark, and unyielding. She had been hunted her whole life, chained and hidden, but now she was free, and she would not be taken. Rowan fought beside her, feeling a new rhythm in the chaos. He was not alone. For the first time in his life, he realized the truth of companionship. Strength was not only in muscle, not only in survival. It was in standing together, protecting each other, and refusing to bow to fear. Minutes stretched like hours. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath. The men began to retreat, surprised, frustrated, unable to break the unity that had formed between the lumberjack and the forest woman. One by one, they slipped back into the trees, dragging wounded pride and bruised bodies with them. When the last shadow disappeared, Rowan sank to his knees, chest heaving, pain shooting through his arms. Leary stepped forward and touched his shoulder, light but firm. "Are you hurt?" she asked, voice trembling, full of care and concern. Rowan shook his head. I will be fine," he said, though the truth was buried beneath the adrenaline. He looked at her, really looked, and something broke in his chest. "You are stronger than anyone I have ever known." She smiled faintly, eyes shining, the first real smile he had seen since the sack came off her head. "I had to fight," she whispered. "I couldn't let them take me, not again, but thank you for being here." Rowan nodded. Words felt small, inadequate. The forest around them seemed alive, the air heavier, filled with the scent of wet earth and something unspoken. It was respect, recognition, a promise that neither would be alone again. That night, Rowan and Leary sat by the fire, tending minor cuts, wrapping bruises with cloth. Neither spoke much. Words were unnecessary. They had faced fear together, they had fought together, and they had survived. Outside, the forest whispered in the dark, wind moving gently through leaves. Inside, a man and a girl shared warmth, courage, and something more precious than any silver or possession: trust. Rowan understood finally, as he watched Leary rest, that saving someone was not always a matter of strength or skill. Sometimes it was simply refusing to let fear win, refusing to let cruelty dictate who belongs to whom. And in that refusal, humanity shone brighter than any blade, any fire, any storm. For the first time, Rowan knew that he had not only protected Leary, but had been changed by her. And that change, he realized, was worth more than any axe, any forest, any life alone. The morning after the fight was quiet, almost too quiet. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see what would happen next. Rowan sat on the porch, cleaning his axe carefully, the blood from the previous day long gone but still fresh in his mind. Leary moved inside, organizing supplies, stacking wood, and tidying the cabin. She worked slowly, deliberately, each movement careful, measured, as if she were learning what it meant to belong somewhere, not just survive. Rowan watched her, sitting back, tired but alert. He had fought off men, faced the threat of losing her, and yet something heavier pressed against his chest now. He realized it was more than fear or relief, it was the weight of choice. Every person has a choice, he thought, but rarely do we see it in front of us so clearly, so fiercely. He had expected her to run. That was the way of the world she had known. Take what you can, flee from danger, survive at all costs. But she did not. She stood in the cabin, small but unyielding, and met his gaze with something that startled him: determination. A rustle in the trees brought Rowan's attention back outside. The merchants were gone for now, but their shadow lingered, a reminder of the world beyond the forest. Rowan knew they would return if they could, but he also knew something else: he would not allow it, and this time he would not fight alone. Leary stepped onto the porch, standing beside him for the first time, fully visible in the daylight. The sun caught the wet strands of her hair, the scars on her skin, and the fire in her eyes. She was no longer the frightened girl from the market. She was something more, a human who had endured chains and fear, who had survived, and who now stood ready to choose her own path. "I could leave," she said softly, voice steady, though the slightest tremor lingered. "I could run. They might come back." Rowan shook his head. "No, you don't have to leave." He looked at her, really looked, and in that moment the forest seemed to hold its breath with him. You belong here if you want, with me, not because I said so, because it's your choice. Leary paused, the weight of freedom settling on her shoulders like a cloak she had never worn before. She reached down and picked up a small branch, twirling it between her fingers. All my life, she said, voice low, I've been told I belong to someone else, chains, sacks, orders, I never got to choose. Her eyes met his, dark and steady, filled with something fierce and beautiful. But I choose now, I choose you. Rowan's chest ached. Words felt too small for what he wanted to say. He wanted to tell her that she was safe, that he would never let anyone hurt her again. But he also knew the truth, she was already strong. She had fought her own battles, survived, and now, standing beside him, she had chosen freely. That was the most powerful thing in the world. The forest seemed to lean closer, leaves rustling softly, birds calling in gentle tones. Even the wind slowed, listening. Rowan reached out and touched her hand lightly. She did not pull away. She let him hold it, a small but profound connection, a promise between two humans who had survived and now chose each other. Time passed slowly. They did not speak much. Words were unnecessary. Each gesture, each look, each shared breath spoke louder than language could. Rowan felt a peace he had never known, a warmth in his chest that was neither solitude nor survival, but something more, companionship, choice, humanity. As the sun climbed higher, they worked together, stacking wood, checking the fire, preparing for the days ahead. Every motion was a shared rhythm, a quiet affirmation that they were no longer alone. Rowan realized that the world beyond the forest, cruel and greedy as it was, could not reach them here, not while they chose each other, not while they stood together. That night, as the cabin filled with the smell of fire and wet earth, Rowan and Leary sat side by side, sharing silence. The forest outside whispered, but inside the warmth between them grew. Leary's head rested lightly on his shoulder for the first time, a gesture of trust, of freedom, of choice. Rowan's hand found hers, fingers entwining. He thought of the men who had tried to take her. He thought of the chains, the sack, the fear that had followed her for so long. And he understood, finally, that it was not strength of arm or steel that mattered. It was courage. It was choice. It was refusing to be broken, refusing to let fear dictate life. Rowan pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head, careful, reverent. We'll face the world together, he whispered. Leary lifted her face, smiling faintly, her eyes bright with fire and relief. Together, she echoed. And for the first time, both of them knew something simple, something humans often forget. That to choose freely, to stand together, and to protect one another was the truest power in the world. Years passed, but the memory of that first night never left Rowan. The forest around his cabin grew thick, wild, and alive, just as he and Leary had grown together. Travelers who dared to come near would speak in whispers of the lumberjack and the girl who was not a girl anymore, a woman of the forest with dark eyes that held both fire and kindness. But Rowan and Leary did not care about stories. They cared about each other, about the life they had built in quiet defiance of a cruel world. Rowan still cut trees, his strong arms swinging the axe with steady rhythm, but now he did so not for survival alone, but for sharing. He stacked firewood neatly for winter, knowing Leary would carry some herself, laughing as they worked side by side. She moved differently than she had in the beginning, confident, free, carrying herself like someone who had reclaimed the world after being told it was never hers. Rowan watched her and marveled at her strength, not the kind that bends metal, but the kind that bends hearts, reshapes fear, and makes the impossible seem possible. The cabin became a home of choice. There were no chains, no ropes, no sacks to hide faces. Freedom flowed in every corner, and trust filled the rooms with warmth. Leary cooked, planted, and explored the forest, leaving little marks of herself everywhere, reminding Rowan that she belonged here, but on her own terms. And Rowan, who had thought life alone was enough, learned that belonging could grow, fragile but unstoppable, between two humans who refused to be cruel to one another. One evening, after a long day of work, Rowan sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees, painting the sky with shades of gold and fire. Leary came out, carrying a small bundle of herbs. She smiled at him, soft and warm, and handed it over. "For your tea," she said simply. That simplicity, that ordinary act, struck Rowan harder than any battle ever had. It was human, gentle, true, a proof that kindness and choice mattered more than any strength he had ever known. He took her hand then, holding it lightly but firmly. "I used to think I was strong," Rowan said quietly. "Strong enough to live alone, strong enough to survive. But I see now, strength is not the axe. Strength is this, letting someone walk with you, letting them choose you, protecting them not because you can, but because you must." Leary leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. Her hand squeezed his. "And you chose me," she whispered. "Every day." "Yes," he replied, feeling a swell of something he had not named before. "Pride, love, perhaps both. And you chose me too." The forest listened. The wind carried their laughter through the trees. The cabin glowed softly in the darkening light. They did not need more. No coins, no chains, no outsiders' opinions could reach them here. All that mattered was choice, courage, and the quiet strength to protect one another. Years later, travelers would speak of that cabin as a place where humans remembered what they could do: care for one another, share life freely, and refuse to let cruelty dictate who belongs to whom. Rowan and Leary never left the forest. They did not need to. They had created a world where freedom was real, where kindness mattered, and where the heart chose not out of fear, but out of love. And Rowan, who once thought he had bought a goblin slave, now understood the truth. Humans are strong not because of what they can take, but because of what they choose to give. And in giving freedom, trust, and choice, they create something no forest, no storm, and no cruel hand could ever break. The forest grew around them, wild and free, reflecting the life they had built together. Trees bent in the wind, rivers sang, and birds called out, celebrating in small ways what humans often forget: that compassion, courage, and choice are the true measures of strength. And in the quiet of their cabin, Rowan and Leary sat side by side, hands intertwined, watching the sun rise and set, knowing that they had found the greatest victory of all: each other freely, fully, forever.